What if I told you that, most of the time, you don't see the truth, you see an interpretation that your brain created in milliseconds? Even before any conscious analysis, before any logical reflection, something has already happened within your mind. A silent conclusion has been formed. A meaning has been assigned. And from then on, everything you perceive revolves around that first invisible impression. Have you ever experienced this? That strange feeling of being absolutely certain about something, only to later discover you were completely wrong? Not because you lied to yourself, but because your brain decided for you. It's uncomfortable to admit, but the truth is that our mind doesn't function like an impartial judge. It functions like a hurried narrator, preferring to tell a quick story rather than wait for the full facts. The problem is that this story seems real. It seems logical. It seems obvious. And precisely for that reason, it is almost never questioned. The brain creates interpretations before the truth because it hates emptiness, hates uncertainty, hates not knowing. Between waiting and filling in the gaps, it chooses to fill them. Always. Even if it means distorting what is right before its eyes. Think about how many times a short message has been read as coldness. How many times silence has turned into rejection. How many times a neutral look has been interpreted as judgment. The fact itself was simple. But the interpretation came loaded with emotion, memory, and expectation. What you felt seemed true. And that's where the most powerful trap of the human brain lies. What you are about to discover may surprise you. Much of what we call reality is, in fact, an internal construct. A hypothesis created in record time. The brain doesn't wait for complete data, doesn't check all possibilities, doesn't cross-reference all evidence. It anticipates. It bets. It decides before you even realize you've decided. And the most curious thing is that this doesn't only happen during moments of distraction. It happens all the time. While you're driving, while you're talking, while you're watching someone enter a room. The mind interprets minute signals and constructs entire meanings. A tone of voice becomes intention. A gesture becomes a threat. A coincidence becomes an explanation. Stay with me until the end, because understanding this process completely changes how you view your own certainties. When the brain creates interpretations before the truth, it's not trying to deceive you. It's trying to protect you. The problem is that the mechanism that saved us in the past doesn't always help us in the present. In a complex, fast-paced, and ambiguous world, automatic responses can generate internal conflicts, misunderstandings, and decisions that seem correct, but aren't. There's an even more unsettling detail. The more emotionally involved we are, the sooner the brain closes off the interpretation. Fear, anxiety, expectation, attachment, all of these accelerate the process. The truth becomes filtered through what we feel, not what is actually happening. And when emotion enters the picture, questioning one's own perception becomes almost impossible. That's why so many people defend wrong ideas with absolute conviction. Not because they are ignorant, but because the brain has already transformed an interpretation into an identity. Letting go of it would mean dealing with the discomfort of, maybe I'm wrong. And the brain prefers any coherent story to that kind of emptiness. This is one of the central ideas that we explore here in Dark Human Science, not to destroy certainties, but to understand where they come from. Because when you realize that the mind creates meaning before truth, something changes. You begin to observe your own thoughts with more distance, more curiosity, less haste. And from that point on, the question ceases to be, is this true? And becomes something much deeper. Something that will take us even further into the invisible mechanisms of the human mind. And perhaps, as you listen to all this, a specific situation has already come to mind. A moment when you reacted too quickly. A judgment that seemed obvious. A certainty that, looking back now, perhaps wasn't so solid after all. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. It could be a personal experience, a question, or even a disagreement. This space exists precisely for that, to transform reflection into real conversation. When you comment, something interesting happens. You're not just writing a text, you're making conscious a process that normally goes unnoticed. You're putting into words what the brain usually resolves automatically. And, moreover, your experience might be exactly the point of connection that another person needed to recognize themselves as well. Sometimes, a comment changes more than we imagine. And if at any point you thought, this has happened to me before, leave a like on the video. It seems simple, but this gesture shows that this type of content makes sense, that it's worthwhile to continue delving into topics that don't always come up in everyday conversations, but that silently influence how we live, decide, and relate to each other. That's how this type of message gains strength and reaches more curious, questioning, restless people like you. Now, if you feel that this deeper look into the brain, perception, and the human mind is something you want to continue exploring, subscribe to the channel. Not as a commitment but as a sign that you want to keep investigating these mysteries with us. Your participation here is what keeps this content existing, evolving, and reaching ever further. None of this is about empty numbers. It's about creating a community of people who don't accept the mind's first automatic response. People willing to observe, question, and go beyond the surface. And that starts right here, in this silent exchange between those who watch and those who decide to get involved. Because from here on out, the conversation will get even deeper. We're going to delve into the specific mechanisms that cause the brain to anticipate meanings, confuse emotion with fact, and defend interpretations as if they were absolute truths. And understanding this can gradually change the way you see not only the world, but yourself. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's something fundamental that almost no one realizes. The brain simply doesn't wait for the truth to arrive. Waiting costs time, energy, and, from a biological point of view, can cost survival itself. Long before concepts like science, logic, or critical thinking existed, the human mind was shaped to act quickly. Too quickly. And that's exactly where this silent chain of interpretations begins, shaping decisions, emotions, and even entire identities. The brain hates waiting because, for it, time has always been synonymous with risk. In primitive environments, hesitation could mean death. Faced with a noise in the dark, there was no room for detailed analysis. The mind needed to decide immediately whether it was a threat or not. This mechanism has endured for thousands of years and continues to operate today, even when the real danger no longer exists in the same way. Technology has evolved, society has changed, but the brain continues to function behind the scenes with the same ancestral logic. Even before analyzing facts, the mind begins to fill in the gaps. When information is lacking, it doesn't accept emptiness. Silence becomes meaning. An isolated detail becomes a complete context. A fragment becomes a story. This filling in doesn't happen consciously. It arises as a feeling of understanding, as if something simply made sense. And when something makes sense, we rarely stop to question where it came from. Assumptions follow almost immediately, almost as an inevitable side effect. The brain combines past experiences, emotional memories, and known patterns to quickly formulate a hypothesis about what is happening. It doesn't matter if this hypothesis is true or not. What matters is that it is functional at that moment. It's a cognitive shortcut. A short path that avoids excessive effort. And the more familiar this path seems, the more confidence it generates. This is how the so-called provisional meaning is born. A temporary explanation that gives the brain a sense of control. Even though it is provisional, it is felt as definitive. The curious thing is that, after this meaning is created, all new information begins to be filtered through it. That which confirms the interpretation is easily accepted. That which contradicts it is ignored, minimized, or reinterpreted. Truth ceases to be the starting point and becomes an optional detail. This is not a flaw. It's not a character flaw, a lack of intelligence, or inattention. It's a deeply ingrained survival strategy. The brain wasn't designed to seek absolute truth, but to ensure continuity, security, and predictability. Truth is often too complex, too ambiguous, too uncomfortable. Quick interpretation, on the other hand, offers immediate relief. It organizes the chaos, even if imperfectly. The impact of this on modern life is enormous. Relationships are built and broken based on hasty interpretations. Important decisions are made based on unverified assumptions. Conflicts arise not from the facts themselves, but from how they were interpreted in the heat of the moment. And the more emotionally charged the situation, the faster the brain closes the issue. There's something almost invisible in this process, the feeling of certainty. When the brain creates a provisional meaning, it doesn't warn that it's just a hypothesis. It delivers the interpretation as if it were reality. And this feeling of certainty is powerful. It guides behaviors, choices, reactions. The person doesn't feel like they're just guessing. They feel like they're seeing clearly. That's why questioning one's own perception is so difficult. It feels like we're questioning ourselves. This dynamic shapes entire mindsets. Over time, repeated interpretations become beliefs. Beliefs become lenses through which the world is viewed. And these lenses are rarely neutral. They carry fears, desires, frustrations, and expectations accumulated throughout a unique personal journey. The hidden truth lies not only in external facts, but in the inner workings of the mind that interprets those facts. What's most intriguing is that, even when contrary evidence emerges, the brain tends to protect the meaning it has already created. Changing interpretations requires energy, it requires admitting uncertainty, it requires relinquishing the feeling of control. To the mind, this sounds like a threat. So it adjusts the narrative, distorts details, rationalizes. All to maintain internal coherence. Not because it wants to deceive, but because it wants to preserve stability. This is one of the great revelations about how humans function. We don't live reacting to the world as it is, but to the world as it has been interpreted. Every decision, every judgment, every emotional reaction passes through this invisible filter. Understanding this doesn't make us immune to the process, but it makes us more attentive, more curious, less reactive. It's the beginning of a silent transformation in the way we observe thoughts, emotions, and certainties. When we begin to realize that the brain creates meaning before truth, something changes in our relationship with our own mind. A small space emerges between stimulus and reaction. An almost imperceptible interval where the question arises, is this a fact or an interpretation? This space is powerful. It is within this space that more conscious choices can be born. It is within this space that the mind ceases to be a hostage to the automatic and becomes more flexible. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation gains even more depth, because understanding that the brain doesn't expect the truth is only the beginning. From here, the specific mechanisms begin to appear, the internal gears that make this process happen without us realizing it. More subtle, more silent layers that are at work all the time while we believe we are in control. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding why interpreting is faster than understanding it completely changes the way we view our own decisions. There is a very clear, and not very intuitive, logic behind it. The brain doesn't choose the truest path, it chooses the most economical path. An economy for the mind has nothing to do with money but with energy. Thinking is expensive. Investigating is even more so. Analyzing possibilities, considering contexts, revising hypotheses, and sustaining doubt requires an enormous cognitive effort. The human brain consumes an absurd amount of energy, even though it represents a small part of the body. Therefore, it has developed a basic operating principle: to expend as little energy as possible to maintain a sense of control. Interpreting is cheap. Understanding deeply is expensive. When you interpret something, the brain uses shortcuts. It quickly cross-references known information, recent emotions, similar memories, and already stored patterns. In seconds, an answer emerges. It's not a checked answer, but it's a functional one. It allows you to move forward, react, decide. Understanding, on the other hand, requires pausing. It requires accepting that you still don't know. It requires sustaining a space of uncertainty. And the brain hates that space. That's why he prefers quick answers to correct ones. Speed brings immediate relief. Correctness brings work. And this pattern appears all the time in everyday life, in such subtle ways that almost no one notices. A WhatsApp message, for example. You read a short sentence, without emojis, without additional explanation. In milliseconds, the mind has already decided on the tone. Cold, dry, impatient, perhaps aggressive. You didn't investigate. You didn't ask. You didn't consider the other person's context. You interpreted. And that interpretation is already loaded with emotion. The same happens with facial expressions. A neutral look can be interpreted as contempt. Silence can be understood as rejection. A delay becomes a lack of interest. The raw fact is simple. But the interpretation is loaded with meaning. And the faster it emerges, the truer it seems. The brain doesn't signal that it's just a hypothesis. It delivers it as if it were a faithful reading of reality. This mechanism has a profound impact on how we construct internal narratives. The mind doesn't wait for complete evidence because that would require continuous energy. Instead, it creates an initial sense and moves forward. Everything that comes after is filtered through that sense. This is how small interpretations transform into great certainties. This is how important decisions are made based on fleeting impressions. This is how conflicts arise without anyone realizing exactly where it all began. There is a crucial difference between interpreting and understanding. Interpreting is reacting. Understanding is investigating. Interpreting quickly closes a story. Understanding keeps the story open for longer. But keeping something open is uncomfortable. The mind likes closure. It likes conclusions. It likes to feel that it has arrived somewhere, even if that place is only a temporary construct. From a scientific point of view, this makes perfect sense. The brain evolved in environments where speed was more important than accuracy. Making mistakes quickly was better than taking your time to get it right. This pattern was rewarded throughout evolution. The problem is that today we live in contexts where threats are not immediate, but the consequences of misinterpretations are profound. relationships, career choices, moral judgments. All of this is impacted by decisions made on autopilot. This preference for quick interpretation shapes the modern mindset. We live reacting to constant stimuli, notifications, messages, images, opinions. There is neither time nor energy to understand everything deeply. The brain goes into economy mode. It chooses shortcuts. It creates quick narratives. And these narratives guide behaviors without us even realizing it. The most curious thing is that, when someone questions our interpretation, the reaction is usually defensive. Not because the interpretation is perfect, but because it has already been incorporated as internal truth. Questioning it sounds like a threat to personal consistency. It's as if admitting doubt means losing our footing. Therefore, we often prefer to protect a wrong interpretation rather than face the discomfort of reevaluating it. This process happens behind the scenes of the mind, far from conscious awareness. The person feels they are being rational when in reality they are merely being consistent with the first story their brain told them. The hidden truth lies not only in the ignored facts, but in the emotional cost of revisiting them. Understanding requires emotional energy, not just cognitive energy. When we begin to notice this pattern, something interesting happens. The rush diminishes. A different kind of curiosity emerges. The quick interpretation begins to be seen for what it really is: a draft, an initial version, not a final verdict. This small internal shift already represents a profound transformation in the way we deal with thoughts and emotions. It's not about eliminating interpretations. That would be impossible. It's about recognizing that they are the first step, not the last. That they serve to guide us momentarily, but should not govern important decisions without review. This awareness changes the inner journey of those who observe their own minds. It makes reactions less automatic, choices more conscious. The impact of this spreads to all areas of life. And the more we understand that the brain prefers economy to precision, the more we realize how much we need to create spaces for pause. Small intervals where the interpretation is not immediately accepted as truth. Where the question arises, silent but powerful. This is the point where the conversation begins to touch on even deeper layers of mental functioning, revelations that explain why certain ideas take hold so strongly and why some interpretations seem impossible to abandon. Comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because there's an even quieter and more decisive level in this whole process: the mind's autopilot. A large part of the interpretations we make don't go through conscious thought, they don't ask permission, and they don't warn you that it's happening. When you realize it, the conclusion has already been formed. The feeling is already in place. The reaction has already begun to take shape internally. And reality hasn't even had time to explain itself. The brain operates in layers. The conscious part, the part you feel as me thinking, is only the surface. Below it lies a fast, emotional system deeply influenced by the past. That's where autopilot works. It mixes past experiences, current emotions, and old fears in fractions of a second. All of this happens before any rational analysis, before any fact-checking, before any more careful internal dialogue. Past experiences function as an emotional database. Old situations, especially those involving pain, rejection, frustration, or fear, are recorded not as neutral memories, but as alerts. When something even slightly similar happens in the present, the brain recognizes the pattern and reacts. It doesn't matter if the current context is different. For the autopilot, similarity is reason enough to trigger the response. Current emotions fuel this process. If you are tired, anxious, insecure, or overwhelmed, the brain becomes even more prone to interpreting things quickly. Intense emotions reduce the ability to wait. They push the mind toward quick decisions because internal discomfort demands immediate resolution. And the quickest way to alleviate this discomfort is to create meaning, even if temporary. Old fears complete this invisible equation. Many of them aren't even consciously remembered. They are learned fears, absorbed throughout life's journey, often in childhood. Fear of rejection, of abandonment, of making mistakes, of not being enough. These fears lurk, influencing interpretations without us realizing it. A neutral comment can be heard as criticism. Silence can be felt as detachment. Objective reality loses ground to the internally constructed emotional truth. What's most intriguing is that, when autopilot kicks in, everything seems extremely logical. The person doesn't feel like they're reacting to old memories or unresolved emotions. They feel like they're just seeing things as they are. That's the power of this mechanism. It doesn't present itself as interpretation but as evidence, as clarity, as reliable intuition. Questioning it seems unnecessary, sometimes even absurd. This process has a profound impact on everyday decisions. Choices are made, words are spoken, relationships are affected based on automatic interpretations of reality. And because these interpretations happen behind the scenes of the mind, they are rarely revised. The autopilot takes control and keeps driving, while consciousness only justifies the path afterward. There's a curious feeling associated with this, a sense of urgency. When the autopilot interprets something as a threat, even a symbolic one, an internal rush to act arises. To respond, to defend oneself, to move away, to attack, to shut down. The mind doesn't wait for confirmation. It acts to protect. And this protection isn't always necessary, but it always seems justifiable at the moment it happens. Over time, this pattern shapes the mindset. The person begins to rely more on automatic reactions than on careful observation. You start making decisions based on what you feel immediately, not on what can be calmly investigated. The transformation happens silently. The world begins to seem more hostile, more predictable, or more disappointing, not because it is that way, but because the autopilot is constantly filtering reality through past experiences. The hidden truth in this process is that the brain isn't interested in justice, precision, or balance. It's interested in security. And security for it means anticipating risks. Even if this generates misinterpretations. Even if it limits possibilities. Even if it creates unnecessary conflicts. The impact of this doesn't appear all at once. It accumulates. Small, automatic interpretations repeated over time build an internal narrative about the world and about oneself. Noticing autopilot in action is a crucial turning point on the journey of self-discovery. Not to eliminate it, but to recognize it. When you begin to notice that certain reactions arise even before you understand what's happening, something opens up. A small space between stimulus and response. This space doesn't bring immediate answers, but it brings awareness. And awareness changes everything. This realization is not comfortable. Sometimes it's disturbing to realize that we're not always reacting to the present, but to old versions of reality. That current decisions are influenced by internal histories that have never been revisited. But it is precisely there that a deeper transformation begins. Not a forced change, but a change in attitude towards one's own mind. And the more this space grows, the more evident it becomes that many of our certainties didn't stem from reality, but from autopilot trying to shield us from something. It's at this point that the conversation begins to touch on even more sensitive layers of human functioning, revelations that help us understand why some interpretations seem so difficult to let go of, even when they no longer make sense. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there is a crucial element that runs through everything we've discussed so far and that almost always goes unnoticed. Emotions as an invisible filter of truth. They not only accompany our interpretations, they shape, distort, and often replace reality before we can even perceive it. The brain does not interpret the world neutrally. It interprets the world based on what it feels. Strong emotions like fear, anxiety, and anticipation are not merely reactions to external events. They are internal lenses that redefine the meaning of everything that enters the brain. When an intense emotion is active, the brain changes mode. It stops seeking understanding and starts seeking protection. And protection in this context means anticipating threats, avoiding pain, and confirming what already seems familiar. Objective truth gives way to emotional truth. Fear is perhaps the most powerful filter. When we are afraid, even if it's a subtle, symbolic, social, or emotional fear, the brain goes into a state of alert. In this state, everything seems more intense, more urgent, more definitive. A small detail takes on enormous proportions. An improbable risk seems imminent. The brain doesn't ask if it's real, it asks if it is real that it could hurt. And if the answer is maybe, the interpretation has already been made. Anxiety works similarly but with a specific characteristic. It projects the future as a threat. When anxiety is present, the brain begins to interpret the present based on what happens next. Silence becomes a sign of abandonment. Delay becomes rejection. A short answer becomes imminent conflict. None of this is confirmed by reality, but all of it is felt as truth. The mind begins to live in a constant state of anticipation. Expectation, on the other hand, seems harmless, but it also profoundly distorts perception. When we expect something, the brain starts looking for signs that confirm that expectation. If we expect something good, we ignore warnings. If we expect something bad, we ignore positive evidence. Reality begins to be read selectively. We don't see what is happening, we see what fits into the story that was already being told internally. That's why two people can experience the same situation and come out of it with completely different interpretations. It's not the world that changes, it's the emotional filter that changes. The external experience is the same, but the internal impact is shaped by distinct emotions, personal histories, and mental states. The truth in this sense doesn't arrive raw. It arrives processed. This mechanism has a profound impact on decisions. When a strong emotion is present, the decision seems urgent. It seems obvious. It seems necessary. The brain senses that there is no time to investigate, wait, or discuss. It wants to resolve the emotional discomfort as quickly as possible. And the quickest way to resolve it is to interpret, to create meaning, to close a story, even if that story is incomplete. The most delicate aspect is that, after emotion shapes the interpretation, the mind begins to defend it. Not because it is true but because it relieved internal tension. Questioning it would mean reopening that tension. It would mean returning to the state of uncertainty that the brain tried to avoid. That is why we often react defensively when someone presents another interpretation of the facts. We are not defending the truth. We are defending the emotional relief that that interpretation brought. This process happens behind the scenes, silently. The person feels they are being rational when, in reality, they are being emotionally coherent. Emotion creates the filter, interpretation passes through the filter, and consciousness then comes in to justify it. It's a complete inversion of the logic we believe we have. We think we feel because we understand. Most of the time, we understand because we feel. There's an important revelation here. Emotions are not enemies of perception, but when they are not recognized, they become its masters. The problem is not feeling fear, anxiety, or expectation. The problem is not realizing that we are feeling them and yet fully trusting the interpretations that arise in that state. The hidden truth is not in the emotion itself, but in how much it influences us unseen. When we begin to notice this emotional filter in action, something changes. Not immediately in the external world, but in our internal relationship with thoughts and certainties. A pause occurs. A moment when the question arises, what is fact and what is emotion? This question doesn't solve everything, but it creates space. And space is the first step towards any real transformation of mindset. It is precisely this type of investigation that allows us to see beyond the surface of human reactions. This is what we explore here on Dark Human Science. Not as a search for simple answers, but as a journey through the invisible mechanisms that shape our decisions, our conflicts, and our perception of reality. Understanding the role of emotions in this process does not make us cold or distant. It makes us more lucid. The clearer our understanding of this invisible filter, the more we realize that many certainties were built during moments of emotional intensity. And when that intensity passes, the certainty sometimes remains, even without support. It is at this point that the mind begins to reveal even deeper layers, because some interpretations are not maintained solely by momentary emotion, but by something even more deeply rooted. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's a critical point where everything we're talking about stops being just an automatic mechanism of the brain and starts becoming a real risk to how we live, relate to each other, and make decisions. When interpretation becomes absolute truth, this is the moment when the brain stops merely creating provisional meaning and begins to defend that meaning as if it were an unquestionable fact. Here a silent shift occurs. The interpretation, which arose to organize chaos and reduce uncertainty, begins to gain the status of truth. Not because it has been confirmed, but because it has been repeated internally many times. The brain clings to the first story it told and, from then on, acts as an advocate for this version of reality. It no longer seeks to understand what is happening. It seeks to prove that it was already right. When this happens, any contrary evidence ceases to be information and becomes a threat. Data that does not confirm the interpretation is ignored, minimized, or reinterpreted to fit the existing narrative. The mind goes into defensive mode. It is no longer about understanding the world, but about protecting internal coherence. The feeling of being right becomes more important than the possibility of being wrong. This is one of the most dangerous aspects of mental functioning, because everything continues to seem logical. The person feels they are being rational, firm, and coherent. But, in practice, they are merely repeating an internal narrative that has never been revised. It is at this point that endless arguments arise where no one truly listens. Each side is not defending facts, but interpretations that have become part of their identity. Think about how many discussions you've witnessed, or experienced, where no one seemed willing to reconsider anything. The argument, the explanation, or the context didn't matter. The conclusion was already reached before the conversation even began. Dialogue turns into a dispute. Exchange becomes an attack. And ultimately, what's being protected isn't the truth, but the sense of security that interpretation offers. Misunderstandings arise precisely there. A phrase is uttered, another person interprets it through their own emotional filters, past experiences and old fears, and this interpretation becomes absolute truth. When the other person tries to explain, it's too late. The explanation doesn't fit because it doesn't resonate. Reality has missed its chance to explain itself. The brain has already closed off the story. This mechanism also sustains certainties that have never been questioned. Ideas about people, about ourselves, about the world. I know how this works. I already know this type of person. It's always been this way. These phrases seem like mature convictions, but often they are just old interpretations that have never been revised. They persist not because they are true but because they are familiar. There is something profoundly human about this. The brain prefers comfortable certainty to honest doubt. Questioning an interpretation that has become absolute truth requires cognitive courage. It requires letting go of the feeling of control. It requires admitting that perhaps we have been misunderstanding for too long. And this affects our mindset, our identity, and how we position ourselves in the world. The impact of this goes far beyond specific discussions. Important decisions are made based on these unquestioned internal truths. Career choices, romantic relationships, moral judgments. The person believes they are making clear decisions when, in reality, they are merely adhering to an old narrative. Personal transformation is blocked at this point because there is no room for new interpretations. What's most unsettling is realizing that the longer an interpretation is defended, the harder it becomes to let go of it. It becomes intertwined with emotions, memories, and lived experiences. Abandoning it seems to erase part of one's own history. That's why many people prefer to cling to a mistaken idea rather than face the discomfort of revising it. It's not conscious stubbornness. It's psychological self-protection. When we look closely, we realize that a large part of human conflict doesn't stem from incompatible facts, but from absolutized interpretations. Each person lives within a version of reality that makes sense to them. And when two versions clash, the brain reacts as if it were being attacked. There is no true listening in this state. There is defense, rigidity, and closure. Recognizing this pattern is a wow moment because it exposes something very intimate. How many times do we defend certainties that we never investigate? How many times do we react to interpretations as if they were immutable truths? How many decisions have been made without giving reality a chance to fully reveal itself? These questions don't bring immediate answers, but they open important cracks in mental rigidity. This is not an invitation to live in permanent doubt or to relativize everything. It is an invitation to realize when interpretation has ceased to be a tool and has become a prison. When it has stopped guiding and started limiting. The hidden truth here is that many certainties give us security, but they also prevent us from growing. They reduce the world to the size of what we already know. As this awareness deepens, something begins to change in how we deal with conflicts, disagreements, and difficult decisions. Automatic reactions lose their power. Curiosity gains ground. The need to be right begins to give way to the desire to understand. This internal movement is not immediate, but it is transformative. It alters the mental journey of those who begin to observe their own certainties more carefully. And the more we realize how an interpretation can crystallize into absolute truth, the clearer it becomes that this is not the end of the story, but just another layer of how the human mind works. Because, behind this intense defense of interpretations, there are even deeper mechanisms, linked to how the brain deals with threat, identity, and belonging. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because there's an even more unsettling point behind all of this. The brain prefers a wrong explanation to nothing. This is one of the most unsettling revelations about the human mind, because it directly confronts the idea we have of ourselves as rational, caring beings guided by the pursuit of truth. In practice, the brain does not tolerate, "I don't know." Cognitive emptiness is unsettling. Uncertainty generates tension. And the mind will do almost anything to get rid of that feeling. The phrase, "I don't know," represents a lack of control. It represents a suspension of meaning. For the brain, this is dangerous. Not because it is objectively threatening, but because it breaks predictability. The human mind was shaped to anticipate, predict, and close stories. When something is left open, the system goes on alert. There is internal pressure to conclude, to organize, to give a name to what is happening. Even if that name is provisional. Even if it is imprecise. Even if it is false. Between waiting for the truth and creating a plausible story, the brain almost always chooses the second option. Waiting requires patience, energy, and tolerance for discomfort. Creating a story only requires resorting to already known patterns. It's quick. It's familiar. It's comfortable. The story doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to seem coherent enough to relieve internal tension. And when that relief happens, the mind interprets it as a sign of success. This is how instant explanations for complex situations arise. Someone's strange behavior becomes a lack of character. A mistake becomes incompetence. Silence becomes contempt. Reality hasn't yet been explained, but the brain has already resolved the discomfort of not knowing. The created story takes the place of truth, not because it has been confirmed, but because it has fulfilled its emotional function. This mechanism operates so automatically that it is rarely noticed. The person feels they simply understood the situation. They don't feel they invented an explanation. They don't feel they filled a gap. The brain presents the story as a logical conclusion, when in reality it arose as a response to the discomfort of emptiness. The hidden truth here is not in the error itself, but in the urgency to close the gap. Emptiness is intolerable because it demands presence. It demands sustaining doubt. It demands admitting that we don't yet have enough information. This goes against the economical functioning of the mind. The brain prefers a wrong explanation that allows it to move forward to an open question that requires waiting. This preference shapes daily decisions, quick judgments, and intense emotional reactions. Think about how many times you've found yourself creating an explanation for something you didn't fully understand. A delay, a change in behavior, a curt response. The explanation arises almost as a reflex. And the faster it emerges, the more truthful it seems. The problem is that, once created, this story begins to influence everything that comes after. It guides emotions, words, attitudes. And reality begins to be interpreted in the light of this initial narrative. There's an even deeper aspect to this. The brain not only creates the story, it clings to it. Because abandoning that explanation would mean returning to the void. It would mean admitting that one doesn't know. And this return to, I don't know, reopens the tension that the mind tried to resolve. That's why, even when contrary evidence emerges, the story is usually maintained, adjusted, refined, but rarely abandoned. This pattern has a huge impact on mindset. People spend years living within explanations that have never been questioned. Stories about who they are, about how the world works, about what to expect from others. Many of these stories began simply as quick responses to misunderstood situations. Over time they became personal truths. They became the basis for important decisions. They became invisible boundaries. The most curious thing is that the brain confuses coherence with truth. If the story makes sense internally, if it fits with emotions and past experiences, it is accepted. It doesn't matter if it corresponds to the facts. The criterion is not accuracy, it's cognitive comfort. The mind wants to reduce the tension of the unknown, not necessarily understand reality as it is. This mechanism helps explain why simplistic theories, easy explanations, and ready-made narratives are so appealing. They eliminate the void. They offer closure. They give a sense of immediate understanding. Even if they are wrong, they alleviate the anxiety of not knowing. And that relief is powerful. It creates emotional attachment. It creates conviction. When we begin to notice this in ourselves, something uncomfortable happens. The suspicion arises that not all our certainties stem from truth. Some were born simply from the need to fill a blank space. This realization can be unsettling, but it is also liberating. Because it opens up the possibility of choice. The possibility of, at certain times, not filling the gap immediately. Of harboring doubt for a little longer. Maintaining the I don't know attitude is an exercise in mental maturity. It's not natural for the brain, but it's transformative for consciousness. In that space, reality has a chance to present itself. New information can emerge. Other interpretations can be considered. The journey ceases to be guided solely by the impulse to close stories and begins to include curiosity, listening, and revision. This is not an invitation to live paralyzed by doubt, but to recognize when an explanation has arisen merely to alleviate discomfort. When a story has been created more to soothe the mind than to understand what is really happening. This recognition changes the relationship with thoughts and emotions. It reduces impulsive reactions. It expands possibilities for choice. As this awareness grows, it becomes clear that emptiness is not the enemy of truth. It is the space where truth can emerge. But this space demands tolerance. It demands slowing down. It demands counteracting the brain's natural haste. And it is precisely there that even deeper layers of mental functioning begin to appear, linked to how we deal with threat, identity, and meaning. Comment below. That makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after understanding all of this, an inevitable question arises: how can we tell when what we are experiencing is an interpretation, and not reality itself? This is the most delicate part of the journey, because it doesn't involve pointing out others' mistakes, but observing one's own inner workings. It is here that the conversation ceases to be merely interesting and begins to be transformative. The first sign almost always appears in the body before it appears in the mind. An emotional reaction that is too quick. A tightness in the chest, sudden irritation, an immediate urge to defend oneself, attack, or withdraw. When emotion arrives before understanding, there is a high chance that the brain has already created an interpretation. Reality has not yet been explored, but the emotional system has already kicked in, as if it knew exactly what was happening. This emotional speed rush is one of the main indications that we are dealing more with an internal filter than with the facts. Another sign appears in the way certainty arises. Not as a constructed conclusion but as an instantaneous conviction. There was no reflection, no comparison of possibilities, no doubt. Just the clear feeling of "I know." This sudden certainty is often felt as clarity, but in practice it is premature closure. The brain found a story that relieved the discomfort of not knowing and decided to stop there. The faster this certainty comes, the greater the chance that it is just a well-fitting interpretation, and not a real understanding. There's also that curious feeling of obviousness. When something seems so evident that questioning it sounds pointless. It's obvious that's what happened. There's no other explanation. Anyone would see it the same way. This type of thinking doesn't stem from objective reality, but from internal familiarity. The brain recognizes a pattern similar to something already experienced and assumes the outcome will be the same. Obviousness doesn't come from facts, it comes from the emotional connection with past experiences. The problem is that these interpretations are often accompanied by a very convincing internal narrative. The mind begins to organize arguments, recall episodes that confirm the reading and ignore details that don't fit the story. All of this happens behind the scenes without conscious effort. The person feels they are simply being logical, when in reality they are being consistent with the first interpretation that came to mind. Understanding this requires a specific kind of attention. It's not attention to the external world, but to the internal rhythm. When something seems too urgent, too definitive, too closed off, it's worth pausing. Not to deny what is being felt, but to recognize that feeling is not the same as understanding. Emotion is information, not a verdict. It signals something important, but it doesn't deliver the complete truth. Another strong indication appears in the difficulty of listening to other versions. When faced with reality, hearing another perspective usually broadens understanding. When we are stuck in one interpretation, listening to the other sounds like a threat. Impatience, irritation, and a desire to interrupt or disqualify arise. Not because the other person is wrong, but because the interpretation has already solidified as internal truth. The mindset goes into defensive mode. This is a key turning point. When we begin to notice that our resistance is not to error, but to doubt, something changes. The question ceases to be, "Who is right?" and becomes, "What am I not seeing yet?" This change doesn't happen all at once. It's gradual, made up of small moments of lucidity amidst the automatic. But each time it happens, the relationship with one's own mind becomes more honest. It's also important to understand how the brain uses the past to interpret the present. Often, the intensity of the reaction doesn't correspond to the current situation, but to something old that has been reactivated. When this happens, the emotion seems too great for the context. The impact is disproportionate. This mismatch is a clear sign that the interpretation is being fueled by emotional memories, not just by current events. None of this means we should doubt everything all the time. The goal is not to live in permanent suspension, but to develop the sensitivity to perceive when autopilot has taken over. When interpretation has arrived before reality. When the story has been created too quickly. This kind of awareness doesn't eliminate mistakes, but it reduces the power they have over important decisions. Over time, this practice changes how we deal with conflicts, choices, and judgments. Immediate reaction gives way to quiet curiosity. Absolute certainty loses its power. Listening gains ground. Truth ceases to be something that appears, and becomes something that is built with more care. This shift in internal posture profoundly alters the personal journey because it shifts the axis from control to observation. And the more we perceive these subtle signs, the accelerated emotion, the instant certainty, the seductive obviousness, the clearer it becomes that interpreting is natural but questioning is liberating. This balance is not easy because it goes against the brain's haste. But it is precisely at this point that the conversation begins to touch on even deeper levels, linked to how the mind learns, adapts, and transforms over time. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because we've reached the point where everything starts to reorganize itself internally. The big turning point happens when questioning ceases to be a threat and becomes a resource. For a long time we have been taught, directly or indirectly, that being certain is a sign of strength, that changing your mind is a sign of weakness, and that doubting yourself is insecurity. But, from the point of view of how the brain actually works, this couldn't be further from the truth. Questioning one's own interpretation is not weakness. It's cognitive intelligence in action. It's the ability to observe one's own thinking as it happens. It's realizing that what seems obvious may only be familiar, that what sounds definitive may only be comfortable. This shift doesn't happen abruptly. It happens when a person begins to realize that automatic certainty exacts too high a price. There is a silent moment when something changes. The reaction still arises, the emotion still appears, the interpretation still tries to impose itself. But, along with that, a small internal distance is born. A minimal space where the question arises effortlessly, what if it's not exactly like that? This question doesn't destroy the interpretation, but it prevents it from becoming a prison. It restores movement to thought. The truth rarely arrives first. What arrives first is the provisional meaning, the quick story, the comforting explanation. The truth usually arrives slowly. It requires time, context, listening, and a willingness to sustain doubt. Therefore, in a brain trained for speed, the truth almost always loses the initial race. But it doesn't disappear. It waits for space. Giving space to truth doesn't mean ignoring emotions or denying intuitions. It means recognizing that emotions are filters, not maps. That intuitions are signals, not final judgments. When a person begins to treat their interpretations as hypotheses, something changes in the way they make decisions. Choices cease to be impulsive and become more aligned with what truly matters. This change has a profound impact on mindset. The need to be right loses strength. Curiosity takes center stage. Instead of reacting to protect oneself, the mind begins to investigate in order to understand. This doesn't eliminate conflicts, but it changes how they are experienced. Dialogue ceases to be a dispute. Disagreement ceases to be a threat. Difference becomes information. Questioning doesn't mean living in constant doubt, paralyzed. It means knowing when to move forward and when to pause. It means recognizing that some certainties need to be strong, but others need to be flexible. This cognitive flexibility is one of the greatest hallmarks of human intelligence. It allows for adaptation, learning, and growth throughout the journey. There is something liberating in admitting that not every interpretation needs to be defended to the end. That some internal stories can be revised without destroying who we are. On the contrary, it is often precisely this revision that gives us back access to more authentic parts of the experience. The hidden truth lies not in abandoning everything we think, but in choosing more consciously what deserves to be upheld. When this shift occurs, the relationship with error also changes. Making mistakes ceases to be seen as failure and becomes a course correction. The person realizes that they were simply operating with the information and emotions available at that moment. And that now, with greater clarity, new decisions can be made. This attitude reduces guilt, rigidity, and excessive self-criticism. It creates space for real learning. Transformation doesn't just happen at the individual level. It spreads to relationships, environments, and collective choices. People who question their own interpretations listen better, react less, and engage in deeper dialogue. They don't need to win arguments to feel secure. They don't need to close stories too quickly. They are able to sustain open conversations, even when there are no immediate answers. This type of intelligence doesn't draw attention. It's not noisy. It doesn't impose itself. It operates behind the scenes of the mind, silently adjusting how reality is perceived. It's an intelligence that knows that haste is the enemy of understanding and that emptiness, when tolerated, can become fertile. Giving space to truth requires courage because it means accepting that we are not always right. But this courage does not weaken us. It makes us more precise, more human, more free. The mind that questions does not lose direction, it gains depth. It ceases to be a hostage of the automatic and begins to consciously participate in its own experience. And when we realize this, it becomes clear that questioning is not the end of the process, but the beginning of something greater. Because by making room for the truth, we begin to see broader patterns, more subtle connections, and even deeper mechanisms that shape our interpretations, our decisions, and our identity over time. It is at this point that the conversation continues to expand, revealing layers that are rarely seen, but that influence everything. Comment below, that makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, it's because something along the way resonated with you. Perhaps an idea, perhaps a feeling of unease, perhaps that silent sensation of recognizing something that's always been there but never been named. If this message resonated with you in any way, comment below. This message was for me. It's a simple way to mark this moment, as if to say, I saw, I felt, I understood. If at any point in the video you found yourself reconsidering certainties, remembering decisions, or rethinking interpretations, leave a like. Not as an automatic gesture, but as a sign of the connection that was created here. This type of content only makes sense when it finds people willing to look a little deeper. And if you feel that this closer look at the brain, perception, and the inner workings of the human mind helps you better understand your own journey, subscribe to the channel. Not out of obligation, but to continue exploring these ideas calmly, deeply, and with curiosity, always respecting the time needed for reflection. There's a video over here that complements this topic and delves even deeper into this conversation. Click on it and continue reading. Sometimes, a fresh perspective is all it takes for something to make sense. Ultimately, perhaps the most important question is not, what is truth? But, how much of what I call truth is merely an interpretation that has never been questioned? That's when the mind begins to reveal itself. This is dark human science, where perception is not reality,